Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, thank you very much. And my name is Michael Atkinson. I'm the director of the Diefenbaker Canada Centre and the executive director of the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy. And in both those capacities, I want to welcome you here today to a very important event and a very important anniversary for all of us at the University of Saskatchewan, the 30th anniversary of this building when it came into existence, and of course the Diefenbaker Canada Centre along with it. I want to indicate, first of all, that the centre and the building is really an asset, a rich asset to the University of Saskatchewan, and inside this building, the work of the School of Public Policy goes on, as well as the Centre for the Study of Co-ops, and others have used this building many times, and so it's been a great gift to the University of Saskatchewan. And of course, inside this building as well reside the archives of Mr. Diefenbaker, and those too are used by scholars from across Canada and around the world. It's more than appropriate that we should have an event like this today to both honor Mr. Diefenbaker's legacy and to help build a public affairs facility such as this one. This is a live place. This is not a place that simply reflects the history of Mr. Diefenbaker. It also reflects the future of Canada in the form of the work of public administration and public policy that goes on here. And so it's only fitting that we should be here today on the 30th anniversary to recognize that. There are many, many distinguished people in the audience today. I want to thank each and every one of you for coming. I want to especially acknowledge Chief Lonechild from the FSIN, who's here today. And I also want to, I'm not sure if Robert Doucette, who's the president of the Métis Nation in Saskatchewan, is here, but we're expecting him as well. As I say, the purpose of the event is to recognize the 30th anniversary of the building and the center, but also, of course, and very importantly, the 50th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. And I just want to draw your attention on my right to the important work that's been done, the exhibit that's been put together for this occasion. We've drawn on the archival materials. We've put together an exhibit here that I'm hoping you'll all have a chance to take a look at. It's on both sides, by the way, so you have to just sort of keep on going around. It's a perfect kind of exhibit and a perfect reminder of the legacy of Mr. Diefenbaker. We're going to hear about that legacy right now from Professor John Courtney, who's going to tell us a little bit about Mr. Diefenbaker and about his legacy. I want to just foreshadow that we will eventually be moving into the room next to me or behind me, into the main gallery, and for an important announcement you've all been briefed on. But first of all, Dr. Courtney is a senior fellow at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy and a professor emeritus here at the University of Saskatchewan. He's the former president of the Canadian Political Science Association, the author of a number of books, many articles. He is the recipient of the Killam Fellowship and a series of other grants, and he is, in short, one of the most distinguished political scientists that this country has produced. And it's fantastic that he is with us here today, but fantastic that he has been part of the University of Saskatchewan and its traditions ever since his career began. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Courtney.
Thank you, Michael, for those very warm remarks, and I'm pleased to speak very briefly about Mr. Diefenbaker's legacy. First, Mr. Premier, we have at least one honourable Minister of Provincial Cabinet here. I saw Minister Cheveldayoff a moment ago. Perhaps there are others here as well. Your Worship, the Mayor, and also Mr. President, Peter MacKinnon is here, and Chief Lonechild. It's a pleasure to have you here, as well as the invited guests. This building in which we're gathered today honors the memory of Canada's 13th Prime Minister, John George Diefenbaker. The event that brings us together is to celebrate the adoption of the 50th anniversary, on the 50th anniversary of the Charter, the Canadian Bill of Rights, and the opening of the Diefenbaker Canada Centre's latest exhibit, which is highlighting that Canadian Bill of Rights. John Diefenbaker was in many ways an exceptional man, and I'm using the term exceptional in a number of different senses. He was a mesmerizing orator who spoke with the force and the cadence of an Old Testament prophet. He sought public office, including the leadership of his own party, on several occasions before finally succeeding in winning a seat in Parliament in 1940 and the Progressive Conservative leadership some 16 years later. He was, as he liked to remind his audiences, of neither French nor English ancestry. He was a man who, in his own stock phrase, called himself an unhyphenated Canadian. He was a self-described advocate on behalf of, or in his words, those who were the average Canadians. And this was long before that term became popular and is now in wide usage. His worldview was narrow. It was framed in many ways by his political wilderness on the opposition benches, his deep suspicion of his own party's establishment, his traditional, almost Victorian values, such as loyalty to the Crown, his prairie roots, and finally his inability to fully understand the province of Quebec. As a prairie populist, he was without a doubt an outsider to the mainstream of Canadian politics, as that had been practiced in this country for more than a century. Yet in spite of these strikingly exceptional, some might argue unusual qualities in a political leader, his record in office from 1957 to 1963 can be seen as having ushered in a new era in Canada, one with which we are now so familiar that we take it for granted, but which at its time constituted a radical shift from what had gone before. It may seem counterintuitive and to some an arguable proposition, but a case can be made for calling John Diefenbaker the first of Canada's modern prime ministers. Here are a few initiatives that are now of his government that now form an integral part of the Canadian and social political fabric. They were undertaken by the Prime Minister and his government over its 6 years in office. And I list only a few of these. The enfranchisement of Treaty Indians in 1960, and he had a warm and close relationship with many, many First Nations people in this country. And this followed upon just on the heels of the appointment of the first Native Canadian to the Senate. He was also instrumental in establishing the Roads to Resources program, and if you think about what that means now to the north and how it created the basic infrastructure without which the subsequent development of the north would not have been possible, that's a huge breakthrough. I should add as well, and Mr. Harper, I'm sure, is very mindful of this fact. It was Prime Minister Diefenbaker who was the first of the Canadian Prime Ministers to fly above the Arctic Circle. His government was also responsible for the creation of two now arguably central agencies, certainly central regulatory agencies. The Board of Broadcast Governors, which of course we now know as CRTC, in 1958, and the National Energy Board, which was created the following year. Also, his government was responsible for the establishment of a federal agency to ensure funding for Canadian athletes who would wish to compete in national and international competitions. This is the first such initiative undertaken in Canada. We now call it Sports Canada. And arguably, some of the most important royal commissions in this country's history were established under Mr. Diefenbaker. These included the Hall Commission on Health Care, responsible now in many ways for laying the groundwork for our medical care program, the Glasgow Commission, which brought about fundamental reforms in the public service, the Borden Commission on Oil and Energy Regulations, and finally the Porter Commission on Tax Reform and Taxation Initiatives. Excuse me. John Diefenbaker had long been convinced, however, that the protection of rights and freedoms of Canadians was, in his own words, fundamental to his philosophy of social justice and national development. As a courtroom lawyer on the prairies for many years, and as an aspirant for the leadership of his party in 1942, 48, and again in 56, Mr. Diefenbaker was single-minded in his quest to have such a bill adopted by Parliament. When that came to pass, finally, in 1960, he regarded that as a crowning achievement of his life. Did the Bill of Rights live up to its author's expectations? It's fair to say that the legacy was not what Mr. Diefenbaker had hoped for as a protective document for the rights and freedoms of Canadians. The courts had little of any significance to say with regard to the Bill of Rights in the years to come. It was invoked successfully in only a small handful of cases, the most celebrated of which was the Supreme Court's decision in 1970 in the Dry Bones case, in which a provision of the Indian Act was struck down. The principal hurdle that the Canadian Bill of Rights faced within legal circles and in courts was that it was a statute of Parliament. In spite of its worthy intentions, it enjoyed no privileged standing over any other act of Parliament. Like any statute, it could be amended or repealed by any Parliament. That all changed, of course, in 1982, when the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms became an entrenched part of the Constitution and interpreted by the courts, as Mr. Diefenbaker had hoped for his Bill of Rights, in a generous fashion that has fundamentally reshaped Canada. We have gone in 50 years from a system of government based on the principle of parliamentary sovereignty to one giving priority to individual groups and rights and freedoms. In spite of its modest impact on on legal decisions and its questionable status in constitutional practice, the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights nonetheless should be seen, in my view, in a different light. It constituted the first step in a continuum to protect fundamental rights and freedoms in this country. Intellectually, the logical extension of the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights of 1960 was the Trudeau Charter of 1982. The 1960 bill helped prepare the way, I would argue, for the far more influential and powerful document that became part of the 1982 constitutional package. In its own way, the legacy of the Diefenbaker Bill of Rights was what we could now call the rights culture and the rights talk about which we hear so much in Canada. It took over 20 years, from 1962 to 1982, to accomplish Mr. Diefenbaker's goal. And ironically, it was his longtime nemesis in federal politics, Pierre Trudeau, together with almost all of the premiers then in office, to finish what John Diefenbaker had begun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. A reminder of the history and the legacy of Mr. Diefenbaker lasts and is with us to this day. It's now my pleasure to introduce someone who will say a few words as well about Mr. Diefenbaker and about the Bill of Rights. And this is Ian MacDonald. Ian MacDonald, who has donated to the University of Saskatchewan the plaque that is on my right, and we'll speak to it in a second, is a columnist with the Montreal Gazette and the Sun Media Group. He's the author of a number of books, most recently Politics, People, and Potpourri, in which he looks at Canadian and American political officials. He is also, and important for schools of public policy, he is also the editor-in-chief of Policy Options, which is Canada's premier public policy magazine and published by the Institute for Research on Public Policy. He's a broadcaster and a speaker who lives in Montreal. He was a minister in the Canadian Embassy in Washington from 1992 to 94, and the chief speechwriter to Prime Minister of Canada from 1985 to 1988. Won't you please join me in welcoming Ian MacDonald?
Thank you, Mr. Premier, Mr. Mayor, President MacKinnon. By the way, Peter MacKinnon does a dead perfect impersonation of John Diefenbaker, which you can ask him to do sometime at a party. First of all, I want to thank Janice MacKinnon and Lee Pennock of President MacKinnon's office for making this happen. This plaque wouldn't have been restored and the donation wouldn't have been facilitated without their work behind the scenes. Proof of the old adage that if you want to get something done, give it to a busy woman. The provenance of this remarkable copper replica plaque of the Bill of Rights is the following, for my colleagues in the media, among others. It was presented to Mr. Diefenbaker on February 19, 1976 at the Progressive Conservative Leadership Convention as a gift from the caucus on his tribute night. He gave it to Tom Van Dusen Sr., a devoted member of his staff who would be one of the pallbearers at his funeral in 1979 and rode the famous funeral train from Ottawa all the way to Saskatoon, and here in his final resting place, and who was one of his biographers. His book, The Chief, is in that behind that glass case there, with his dedicated copy to the Prime Minister, to the former Prime Minister. His book is known as The Chief, and it was a rather more sympathetic and balanced portrayal than Renegade in Power. Mr. Van Dusen would later serve as caucus advisor to Prime Minister Mulroney, and the plaque hung framed in his office in the center block on Parliament Hill until 1989, at which point, on his retirement, he gave it to me. He is my former father-in-law, and it hung in my office in Ottawa and at the embassy in Washington. In the course of several moves, it ended up in a box in my basement, where it has remained for the last decade until it was restored in the last year, lovingly restored by Anita Henry in Montreal. Of course, it doesn't belong in a basement. It belongs here at this living memorial to Mr. Diefenbaker and his final resting place. And on the 50th anniversary of the Bill of Rights and a week before what would have been his 105th birthday, I can't think of a more appropriate occasion to have this unveiling and to consider the legacy of Canada's 13th Prime Minister. As some of you probably know, his statue stands on Parliament Hill just outside the center block below the Prime Minister's office. And in it, he strikes a very typical Diefenbaker pose as an oratorical pose, and he's holding a Bill of Rights in his right hand. I was privileged to work with Prime Minister Mulroney on his remarks at the unveiling of that statue with some help from Tom Van Dusen. And I do remember very well the closing line, which stands the test of time. For his life, we are a better people living in a better land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian, for those remarks and for this remarkable gift. This is, as you quite correctly put it, this is the right place for this plaque. We'll take very good care of it. I wanted to mention, by the way, that the exhibit that I referred to before was curated by Teresa Carlson, who works at the Diefenbaker Center and is responsible in many ways for meeting the timelines that were required to put all of this together and bring things together. In fact, I should say that in many ways, everything is kind of lined up, with the exception of the weather. But we're working on that. But it's been really remarkable. It's been a remarkable set of last few months as we pulled the event together, and we got the interest of folks in Ottawa and here in the province, and of course Mr. MacDonald's gift. So thank you again very much for that, Ian. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask you to assemble inside this gallery room. I won't do that right now. We're running about, and I have a very detailed agenda here, we're running about 6.5 minutes ahead of time. So you'll have a few minutes just to have a chat with one another, but I will call you again to order in a few minutes and ask you to assemble inside the gallery space for further announcements. So thank you very much for your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Michael Atkinson. I'm the director of the Diefenbaker Canada Centre and the executive director of the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy, which is located here in the Diefenbaker Building. Mesdames et messieurs, bienvenue au bâtiment Diefenbaker et au centre Diefenbaker. Cette année est le 30e anniversaire de tous les deux. Nous sommes très heureux de pouvoir le célébrer avec vous, avec le Premier ministre de la province, et le Premier ministre du Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the 30th anniversary of the Diefenbaker Centre, and we are delighted, indeed privileged, that we can celebrate this anniversary with the Premier of the province of Saskatchewan and the Prime Minister of Canada. It's my pleasure now to introduce the President of the University of Saskatchewan, one of the longest-serving presidents in Canada, and certainly one of the best, without a doubt, my friend and colleague, Peter MacKinnon.
Thank you very much, Michael. I am old enough to remember John Diefenbaker very well. I remember in the years running up to his 6 years in office from 1957 to 1963. I remember attending in my native province of Prince Edward Island many political rallies at which Mr. Diefenbaker spoke. I remember the man for many reasons. But the single most prominent of those reasons, as I reflect back on it, was his passionate love for Canada. And that was a passionate love for our country that made itself felt in many, many ways, including in the period leading up to the signing of the 1960 Bill of Rights that we have commemorated and continue to commemorate here, and that we were so honored to receive a marvelous gift from Ian MacDonald earlier. His love for this country was evident in his respectful relationship with Aboriginal people. And the relationships with Aboriginal people, as we all know so well, were not always as respectful as they ought to have been. But what I remember when I think back to those years, when I was a teenager and an impressionable one, what I remember more than anything else was Diefenbaker's northern vision. His belief and his understanding of the country as a northern country, and the significance of that northern geography to this land. And so when we think back on our 13th Prime Minister, it is appropriate that we have today our 22nd Prime Minister, who has given voice and substance and clarity to the northern vision of our 13th Prime Minister. And for that, sir, we applaud you. We welcome you to the University of Saskatchewan. We welcome you to the Diefenbaker Centre, of which we are so enormously proud. Ladies and gentlemen, the Prime Minister of Canada, the Right Honourable Stephen Harper.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Peter, for that very kind and generous introduction. I want to welcome all of my colleagues who are here, Minister Lynn Yelich, MPs Brad Tross, Randy Hoback, and Kelly Block. Nice to have all of you here. Also, Mayor Atchison, Mayor Sparrow, Chief Lonechild. Nice to see all of you here as well. Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am indeed very pleased to be here today in Saskatoon at the beautiful University of Saskatchewan campus for a cause that I know is dear to the hearts of many, many Canadians, especially in this great province of Saskatchewan. Depuis 1980, le Centre du Très Honorable John G. Diefenbaker pour l'étude du Canada commémore le souvenir du 13e Premier ministre de notre pays. Since 1980, the Right Honourable John G. Diefenbaker Centre for the Study of Canada has nourished the memory of Canada's 13th Prime Minister. It has preserved his papers, his books, and his memorabilia. And through public outreach programs and research, it has sought to educate Canadians about the ideas of one of our country's most famous citizens. For the ancient injunction, "Let us now praise famous men," was coined for men like John Diefenbaker. Diefenbaker, as Peter said, now, I should say that I do have some memories of John Diefenbaker, a little bit fuzzier than yours. My government leader in the Senate, Marjorie Le Breton, who actually worked for John Diefenbaker as her first job, says that I do a very good John Diefenbaker impression, but I'm going to spare all of you that today. John Diefenbaker was a man of great passion and vision, and of seldom matched rhetorical power. He was also a Canadian patriot to his very core, as Peter mentioned. Importantly, he stood for certain values, and he vigorously defended certain principles that are fundamental for the Canadian people, for the system of Canadian government, and for the relationship between them. Aux yeux de John Diefenbaker, tous les Canadiens et toutes les Canadiennes étaient égaux devant la loi. Selon lui, les pouvoirs du gouvernement n'étaient pas illimités, et pour concrétiser ces principes, il a présenté notre première déclaration des droits. John Diefenbaker believed that all Canadians were equal before the law. He believed that the powers of government were not without limit. Above all, he believed in freedom, and that the essence of freedom was that law-abiding citizens should not suffer arbitrary intrusions into their lives from their government. To give practical expression to these principles, he stood before the House of Commons on Canada Day, then Dominion Day, in 1960, and introduced Canada's first Bill of Rights. You will see its ringing declarations displayed prominently here, and here in the Centre's files, among the many other valuable particulars and its dedicated curators conserve, you will find the words Diefenbaker spoke to Parliament that very day. Je suis Canadien, libre de m'exprimer sans crainte, libre de pratiquer ma religion comme je l'entends, libre de défendre ce que j'estime juste, libre de m'opposer à ce que j'estime injuste, libre de choisir mes dirigeants de mon pays. Je m'engage à préserver pour moi-même et l'humanité tout entière cet héritage de liberté. He said once again, I am a Canadian, a free Canadian, free to speak without fear, free to worship God in my own way, free to stand for what I think right, free to oppose what I believe wrong, free to choose those who shall govern my country. This heritage of freedom I pledge to uphold for myself and all mankind. What can one add to that? In fact, I remember as school children, we actually used to recite that regularly in my school. Le Centre Diefenbaker joue donc un rôle national fondamental, celui de préserver cette noble aspiration. The Diefenbaker Centre therefore serves a profound national purpose as keeper of this noble inspiration. The time has now come to offer some tangible recognition of its value. Our government believes that Canadian communities deserve strong and modern infrastructure that will last for decades to come. We also know that investing in infrastructure today will create jobs and help keep Canada's economy moving into the future. And we recognize government's responsibility to maintain and care for our nation's heritage. J'ai donc l'immense plaisir de vous annoncer qu'en partenariat avec l'Université de la Saskatchewan, le gouvernement du Canada fera une contribution substantielle à la rénovation du Centre Diefenbaker. And so it is with great satisfaction that I can tell you today that in partnership with the University of Saskatchewan, the Government of Canada will make a substantial investment in rejuvenating the Diefenbaker Canada Centre. Our government's support will allow the Centre to better display its valuable collections. Actually, the federal government has been a major contributor to the Diefenbaker Canada Centre from the start. While John Diefenbaker was Chancellor of this university, he announced his desire that his archives should be housed on this campus. The government of the day concurred and financially supported construction of the Centre. It is entirely fitting, therefore, that 30 years after the Centre opened and 50 years after John Diefenbaker endowed Canada with its Bill of Rights, our government continues to support this national treasure. This is not, by the way, the only investment that our government has made in Saskatchewan or indeed in Saskatoon itself. I just mentioned a few others while I'm up. Users of Highway 11 can hardly have failed to notice work on twinning from Warman to Highway 2 south of Prince Albert. Our government has also invested heavily in improving water quality and supply in and around Saskatoon, And as you can have too much of a good thing, there's also a flood control project as well. En fait, si on inclut le centre Diefenbaker, notre gouvernement a investi dans 91 projets de la région de Saskatoon et dans près de 1100 projets dans l'ensemble de la Saskatchewan. In fact, including support for the Diefenbaker Centre, our government has invested in 91 projects in the Saskatoon area and nearly 1,100 across Saskatchewan. It's part of Canada's Economic Action Plan, our plan to deal with the worst global recession since the Second World War. Dans le cadre du Plan d'action économique du Canada, le gouvernement du Canada a investi dans près de 16 000 projets d'infrastructure dans l'ensemble du pays. Under Canada's Economic Action Plan, the Government of Canada has invested in almost 16,000 infrastructure projects across the country. When combined with the contributions of our provincial, municipal, territorial, private partners, close to $60 billion has been committed to infrastructure projects from coast to coast to coast. And we are seeing the benefits. Canada has done better during the recession, far better, in fact, than its peers among the advanced countries. L'économie canadienne a créé près de 400 000 emplois au cours des 12 derniers mois. Close to 400,000 net new jobs have been created by the Canadian economy over the past year. But as you know, ladies and gentlemen, and I say this everywhere, in this fragile global recovery, nothing can be taken for granted. Nous devons maintenir le cap. Nous devons continuer à nous concentrer sur l'économie et les emplois, and we must stay on course. We must continue to be focused on the economy and on jobs, and that is why we make and are continuing to make strategic investments like this one. On a personal note, just before I relinquish the podium, I'd like to thank this center's staff once again for the valuable assistance they rendered in preparing my northern tour in 2008, when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the founding of Inuvik. As you will recall, the very existence of Inuvik owes much to Mr. Diefenbaker and his vision, as Peter spoke, of a Canada of the North. It was a vision that proved prophetic, and your part, this center's part, in recalling that highly successful and enjoyable occasion was much appreciated and, of course, has given much inspiration to our government today. Mesdames et messieurs, au nom du gouvernement et en fait de tous les Canadiens et Canadiennes, je tiens à rendre hommage au Centre Diefenbaker et à tous ceux et celles qui accomplissent des travaux précieux. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the government and indeed all Canadians, I want to applaud the Diefenbaker Canada Centre and all those engaged in its valuable work. Our joint investments here will lead to an impressive new centre, and I'm looking forward to seeing it complete. Merci beaucoup. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prime Minister, for the support, the ongoing support of the Government of Canada for the work of the Diefenbaker Centre. Thank you also for your remarks today and your reminders about the legacy of Mr. Diefenbaker and its importance for our country. Mr. Diefenbaker, as I think you all know, is an alumnus of the University of Saskatchewan, as well as a very prominent person from the province of Saskatchewan. It's fitting, therefore, that I'm able to invite to the podium today another alumnus of the University of Saskatchewan and a very prominent citizen. Please welcome the Premier of the province, Mr. Brad Wall.
Thank you, Michael. Prime Minister, Mr. President, members of Parliament, members of the Legislative Assembly, members of the Executive Council, mayors of Saskatoon and Prince Albert, Chief Lone Child, special guests, Judge Arnott, great to see you here as well today, understandably so, given what we are marking here. It is a pleasure to be here. I woke up at about 2 this morning in Ottawa, local time, to get here, and I have now a bit of an appreciation for what you do and our MPs do on a regular basis. This is a a big country, but it's just great to be here. So I just want to say a few brief things, if I can. I want to thank the Diefenbaker Center staff for what they do day in and day out. I was last here, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to admit this, Michael, but I was last here when I was working on a project, I think assigned by Professor Courtney, actually. And I'm not sure how fair I thought the assignment was at the time, but I was happy to be here and happy to be to avail myself of this amazing place that is now going to get a major shot in the arm because of the national government's decision, because of your decision, Prime Minister, and the Government of Canada's decision to support it. And so for that, before I say anything else, we say thank you. You were here just a few months ago when our farmers also needed some help. And you were there again for our farmers in Saskatchewan, and so were our members of Parliament, so was the federal government. We say thank you for that. It has been a pleasure to work with the federal government on infrastructure projects because they made a commitment when all the premiers were gathered at the beginning of all of this very difficult economic time. And the Prime Minister and the federal government made a commitment to make sure the investments in infrastructure and the stimulus flowed quickly. And I think everybody was hoping that might be the case, but wondering based on decades previous if it could be possible. I could tell you this, it was more than possible. It was done. That promise was kept, and we were able to make some very, very important investments right across our province, and the federal government did, of course, right across the country. Professor Courtney alluded to something Mr. Diefenbaker once said in 1967 when he said, "I was criticized for being too much concerned with average Canadians. I can't help that," he said. "I'm one of them." And so he was our champion, especially for those of us from the prairies, from Saskatchewan. He worked for us. And I think he had average Canadians in mind when he was fashioning that Bill of Rights for our country, as well as all citizens. In a recent article on Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights, the author, Thomas Axworthy, said, "Individual freedom stands unchallenged as the supreme political value of the Western world. It is a value that thousands of Canadian soldiers have died for, most notably in World War I and II, and most recently in Afghanistan," close the quote. He goes on to say that for most of our nation's history, Canadians were content to abide by the British precedents of common law when it came to protecting their freedoms. Content, that is, until a young prairie lawyer became determined, as has been highlighted in the history of Mr. Diefenbaker, to change that. And here we now stand marking that particular determination 50 years later, and the Bill of Rights that was the gift of Prime Minister Diefenbaker to the entire country. In order to, though, celebrate that properly and ensure that others are aware of his legacy and others can learn about this very important historical figure in our country, we need to be able to support centers like this. And so, again, I say, and close with this, thank you to the university for its support of the center, President MacKinnon. Thank you to the center staff. Prime Minister, thank you for being here, and thank you, through you, to your government for their support of this very, very important center. God bless.
Thank you very much, Mr. Premier, for those remarks. Thank you again, Mr. Prime Minister, for the support that the Government of Canada is providing to this centre. I want to also recognize and acknowledge that you've taken time out of your day to come here and be with us to celebrate this. Thank you to the mayors, thank you to the members of Parliament, to ministers in the Saskatchewan government. Thank you, everyone, for being here. This day could have passed unremarked. We might have simply taken it for granted that bills of rights come into play and it's all part of our world now. But it's important to look back. It's important to remember. It's important to be part of history and to recognize history, and we're doing both today. This is a historic moment for Canada. It's good to remember that. It's a historic moment for the Diefenbaker Canada Centre. So again, my thanks for your generosity, all of you.
Thank you very much. This building is the home of the Diefenbaker Canada Centre, as has already been said. It is also the home of the Johnson Shoyama School of Public Policy, whose director is right here, Dr. Michael Atkinson. Both the Diefenbaker Canada Centre and the School of Public Policy have and will have benefited greatly from the announcements that have been made today, Prime Minister. and we thank you again for them. May I also, in your presence, thank Ian MacDonald for the marvelous plaque, that marvelous gift on which we find those wonderful words of the 1960 Bill of Rights. I would encourage those of you who have not yet had the opportunity to see it, to witness it, and to read those words. May I also thank you, Premier Wall, for being with us today on a very important day, obviously, for the Centre and the school and the University of Saskatchewan. And Prime Minister in particular, you. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for an announcement that gives us great encouragement about the future of the Diefenbaker Canada Centre. Delighted to have you with us, and thank you so much. Thank you, sir.